Good morning. Welcome to another Simple Truth. We've been looking at the story of Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5. Last week, I challenged you with this whole idea of Naaman was sent by his king to the king of Israel when the maidservant, the servant of Naaman, the little girl who sent him, wanted him to go to the prophet. And it said there are things that just make sense to us as far as a chain of command or who we should go to or who we should use and those kind of things. And sometimes we don't listen to the details of what God has told us because something else just seems to make more sense. And to Naaman, to the king, it made more sense that the king would send Naaman to the king. Like that's the appropriate chain of command. That's the appropriate relationship. But that's not what God asked. And so I want to pick up this story in verse 6 again. And it said this, "And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, 'When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of leprosy.'" And we talked again about the idea that sometimes we get this idea that we have to fix or we have to make happen whatever it is that God has laid upon our heart. And the truth of the matter is this was always a God thing. We've seen it from the very beginning. But somehow this turns into a man thing. And often you and I, if we pay attention, we can see that. We can see that in the ways that our church deals with things, in the way that we deal with things, in the way that our workplace deals with things. There are moments that are God moments that man commandeers. There are moments that God has set up to do something extraordinary in your life and in my life, but we commandeer those moments and we settle for less, or we actually cause confusion and frustration, discouragement, and even anger because we demand that some man do that which God has purposed in his heart he's going to do. There have been a lot of times in ministry where I've done this, where I've heard from God, and then I took it upon myself to make it happen. You've heard me say again and again that we don't work for God, we work with God. With God means he's doing something, and we're just simply joining him. For God means he expects that you're going to do this, that he's going to judge you accordingly. God has a desire to work with us. He wants his plan to come about because it's his plan. And because it's his plan, he's going to use the resources that are necessary to get done what he wants to get done. When we commandeer his plan, we tend to not use the resources that God has laid before us. We use what makes sense to us. And so we overlook people, specifically people, who God might want to use to be a part of his plan, but that doesn't make sense to us. That somehow we've discounted them, disqualified them, or we've overqualified them. And God says, no, I want to put this together. So I want you to look at verse 7. It says this, "And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, 'Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking to quarrel with me.'" I want you to see the king's response. You see, when God's in something, the response of someone who hears is more like Mary. They ponder, they contemplate, they think. There's something in their spirit that checks and says, you know what? It seems a little outlandish, seems a little out of the norm, seems like maybe it's above my pay grade, but there's something within me that tells me this is right. That's when God wants to do the extraordinary. He sets up within us a spirit to accept the extraordinary. We don't have to know the whys because we're focused on who our God has said this is what he wants to have happen. And when we're focused on who, the whys dissipate, they go away because the who overpowers. I am more excited about teaming up with my God than worried about what he's asking or why he's asking it. And notice that's not the king's response. The king's response is to tear his clothes and all of a sudden to speak truth. This is an ungodly king who is now speaking with godly truth. Am I God to kill and to make alive again? He recognizes God's position and declares God's position in trying to defend himself. This happens frequently and often. Truth is stated by people who are not seeking truth. They're not representing truth, and they really truly don't want anything to do with truth. But every once in a while, God speaks through ungodly people. It's why we have to pay attention. It's why we don't just discount everything that everybody says. Because sometimes God uses the ungodly to speak truth. Sometimes he uses the ungodly to do truth and to represent his truth, which is this whole story. The majority of the players in this story are ungodly in nature. Some of them know more about God than others, but all of them are not deliberately seeking God in any way. Naaman's seeking healing. His king is seeking healing for Naaman, and the king of Israel looks at this and assumes that the king of Syria is just trying to pick a fight. That he's just trying to goad him into coming into battle, to getting him angry. That when he says to him, I'm not God, I can't do this, that the king of Syria's response is going to be anger and retribution in nature. That probably should sound familiar to you and I. That there are times when we assume that what somebody is doing or what they are saying, it's just to provoke us. It's just to get us going. You can remember, I remember being back in elementary school and kids who would do that specifically to substitute teachers, get them going on purpose. I remember in 4th grade, I had a teacher who rang a little bell whenever she wanted us to come together and to do something. And we had this boy who got so annoyed with the little bell, and it was an annoying little bell, that he grabbed it one day, ran to the window, and threw it outside. My 4th grade teacher was in tears, devastated, because the bell had been a gift. It had been passed down from generation to generation in her family. And really, what she was using it for was an heirloom, an active, a useful heirloom. But we found it to be annoying, and so we went outside and spent a long time in the snow looking for this bell that had been thrown away because we didn't find value in it. We didn't look at it the same way that she looked at it, and quite frankly, this kid just wanted to get the teacher going. That's exactly what's happening here. The king of Syria doesn't find value in what the people of Israel are supposed to be about. He just wants to get the king going. He just wants to find a reason to pursue battle. That's what the king of Israel thinks here. But it's not. God's about ready to do something. So here's my challenge for you this morning. Don't immediately assume that God isn't involved, that God isn't using those who come up against you. There's a book written by Ron Carpenter that's called The Necessity of the Enemy. And it talks about the fact that sometimes God uses an enemy, someone who is against us or against our God, to get us where our friends wouldn't take us. Sometimes God uses an enemy to get us where we aren't willing to go. This is what happens in this story. God's using an enemy of Israel to bring himself glory. He's using this story to show you and I that God uses the just and the unjust. And God uses the godly and the ungodly however he sees fit. He allows things to happen in a long storyline so that he can get glory at the end of it. We see it all the time. Yet you and I react the same every time something like this happens. We just assume the worst. We assume people are out to get us. We assume that people are out to persecute us. We curl up in a ball and we complain. God says, don't think like that. Consider that I would use the ungodly people around you, just as I use you to the ungodly people, to the godly people around you. So what if today we opened up our eyes to the possibility that the picture's bigger than what we can think, that our God has a bigger plan in store, one that involves not just the godly, but using the ungodly to get him the glory that he desires. God ultimately wants all eyes upon him. He wants all eyes upon him because he doesn't want any to perish. So be willing today to think bigger about what's going on around you.